Hey guys, so today I'm going to be pulling some neck blanks out of these large billets of mahogany here. Most of these Honduran mahogany necks are going to be for the student workshops, by the way. I do have one special piece of zebra wood here, which I'll be using on the guitar number 57 that I'm working on right now. So that's kind of cool. I'm excited to use something completely different here. I don't really know exactly what to expect from this. So that'll all be new and interesting to me. Honduran mahogany is of course the gold standard in guitar necks. Can't go wrong with that. I know what to expect with Honduran mahogany. So anyway, let's go ahead and make some neck blanks. Now I could start by squaring up the billet before I cut out the individual lengths for the neck blanks. However, it's already relatively square, but not perfectly square, so it makes sense to first cut out the individual lengths for the neck blanks, and then I'm going to square up those pieces individually. Just wanted to make that note here so you know that there's multiple ways to approach this. Here I'm using a marking gauge to score a line which will act as a guide for passing this through the bandsaw. When I mark this line, I'm making sure to account for the kerf of the blade and also a little bit extra just to account for the amount of material that I'm going to lose in squaring up and dimensioning the blank. So I definitely want to cut them a little oversized at this point. Now I score a line for the second blank that I'm going to cut out and cut that on the bandsaw and just continue, rinse and repeat that cycle until I have all my blanks cut from these large billets. It's easier to follow your line freehand like this rather than setting up a fence, because with blanks of this height and length, the tendency for the bandsawed blade to drift from one end of the cut to the other can be fairly extreme, and trying to do this with the fence on tends to exacerbate that drift, whereas freehanding it you can account for and control the drift. Okay guys, so I've cut these all out into individual blanks. You can see here I have quite a number of blanks, including my beautiful zebra wood one. And these were cut, of course, quarter sawn, so that you can see that chalk there is just kind of making it a little more obvious which direction the grain lines are going, the end grain, so that your quarter sawn face is here on the wide portion of the board rather than on the thickness portion of the board. Just gives it more strength that way as a neck. You don't want flat sawn necks. And now these individual blanks are not going to be totally square yet or really consistent from one end to the other. And that's what we want to do next. The process of dimensioning this into a consistent rectangle of wood now involves first passing the wide face and then the edge over the jointer to make one corner of the piece totally square all the way across. So next step, take this over to the joiner and get that square edge on every single piece. So I just finished restoring this joiner. If you watch my previous video called Restoring an Old Craftsman Joiner, you can see how I did that. And so I just got this thing functional, and I don't really have a place to put it in the shop yet, so it's actually sitting uncomfortably right in the middle of my shop until I figure out somewhere to put this thing so it's out of the way. However, it's working great. Super happy with it. By the way, you can get this job done, as I have for the longest time, just with a shooting board and a hand plane. Preferably a large hand plane like a jack plane, or even better, a smoothing plane. The jointer just makes this job quicker. And when I'm dimensioning as many blanks as I am right now, that's something that I really want. So once I have one of the wide faces flattened, I then flip the board onto its side with that cleaned up wide face against the fence and pass that through, and that will cut that edge perfectly square to that now flattened wide face, giving you one square edge to work off of. Okay, now let's finish up the rest of these in super fast motion. Once again, I'm flattening the wide face and then squaring up the edge. So one thing to consider before you take a board to the jointer is if you have one like I do here, the zebra wood one, that has a significant warp into it. I'm not sure if you can see that, how I can seesaw it back and forth like that. It's because the whole board is kind of bowing like this. Just enough to where it can be a problem with the jointer. All this means is that instead of passing it over the jointer when I pass it on its edge, instead of passing it on this side, I want to pass it down on this side, just because it's much more stable that way when I'm passing it through. This can't really reference appropriately on the level table, but this side can. See? No rock. Just something to consider when you have severely bowed and cupped wood. So now that each piece has a flat face and a square edge, I take it to the table saw and run it through the table saw with the flat face down referenced against the table and that square edge referenced against the fence. That way, now the table saw can cut these blanks to the width I want and at the same time square up that opposite edge. And if there's any taper along the length of that piece, it's going to correct and remove that taper. You might think, well, if the jointer squares up one edge, why not then just flip it around and run the opposing edge on the jointer as well? You could do that. That would square up that edge, but it wouldn't do anything about a taper that you might possibly have from one end of the blank to the other. And finally, now with two edges flat and square and one face flat and square, I simply need to square up and flatten the last face. And the best way to do this is simply to pass it through the planer. Since the cutter head of the planer is parallel to the planer's table, then as long as I pass the workpiece with the already flattened side down, it will cut the opposing face parallel to that already flattened face, which also means that it will be square to the sides, thus leaving the whole rectangle flat and square all the way around. And as I'm doing this, I check intermittently with a caliper so that in the end I can arrive at my final thickness. Okay, great. So now all of these blanks are flat along its length on any face you rest this on. And they're square on any face that you rest the square on. And they're thicknessed down to the thickness that I will be using, which by the way is 20.5 millimeters, but that's just very specific to my purposes. You might be using different measurements per whatever instructions you're following or plans you're using. Either way, if you have a decently outfitted shop with some equipment, a great way to dimension lumber in preparation for things like guitar necks is to start out with rough cutting your individual pieces on, I use the bandsaw, but you can use a number of different machines for that, and then using the jointer to square up one face, the table saw to square up the opposing face, and then a planer to square up and thickness the final face. If you learned something here, please give this video a like and subscribe so you can be notified when I release a new DIY guitar making video every Friday. And if you want to really learn more, take one of my structured online courses at ericschaferguitars.com or register for a hands-on guitar building workshop here with me in Burnville, Pennsylvania.